Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the second in our pre-Shavuot video series on honorable and noted Jewish women from the past. Today, actually, I would like to focus on someone who was not considered part of our faith, but nevertheless is central to one of the most popular books in the Bible. I am talking now about Vashti, whose story from the Bible, from the book of Esther, is only told too briefly. Before getting into Vashti, just a brief comment on what I see as a very positive trend in modern life. I am probably somewhat of an anomaly in that, or for my generation, in that I have always done the cooking, the baking, the shopping. In the past, I willingly and very happily went with my daughters to shop for clothes. So those things were always second nature to me, and I know that that was not the case among many men of my generation, in fact, even younger men today. So it does please me when I go to the supermarket and I'm finding an abundance of men. There are many more men who are in the supermarket, an indication that even though it's gradual and even though some places perhaps I think we still live an Ozzie and Harriet existence, there are more men becoming active in the home and with their kids and with shopping and in the kitchen. So I think that's a very good sign. Unfortunately, antiquity doesn't yield many examples of this kind of equality, simply because most of the texts, certainly most of the Jewish texts, were written by men. I'm going to share with you a couple of texts concerning Vashti, and you may even be surprised by some of what you hear. Again, remembering that when we talk about these texts, we have to consider the milieu, the environment in which they were written, the fact that they were all written in antiquity. They don't represent contemporary thinking, and they don't represent contemporary authors. They're not written by contemporary authors. Nevertheless, when it comes to Vashti, the book of Esther tells us very little. We know that Vashti refused to appear before the king. The king was having an elaborate celebration, lots of revelry, lots of alcohol, and he summoned the queen to come in all of her beauty. Commentators suggest that he wanted her to come unclothed, and she refused. And because she refused, she was banished with the understanding that a decree would be issued throughout the kingdom of Persia, announcing that all women must obey their husbands. That's what we know. The question really is, what crime has Vashti committed other than refusing the king's invitation? That may be in its time an egregious offense, but that's all we know. In terms of her punishment, we really know less. We know that she no longer she's deposed as queen, but we really don't know what happens to her. Was she just banished from the kingdom, or was her punishment more severe, as suggested? But I would go on and I would ask another question, which I think for our purpose is even more central and more important. Was Vashti powerless? The text might initially suggest, because the king summoned her and when she refused, the king banished her, it might suggest that she was powerless, but I would suggest to you the opposite. I do not believe that Vashti was powerless at all. If you think about it, a powerless person is often ignored. Powerlessness suggests that one is being ignored. I think there is no more severe a punishment or a statement than when we ignore somebody. Ignoring someone suggests that one is just without significance. That is not the case with Vashti. Were Vashti truly powerless, why would anybody fear her? Why wouldn't they just dismiss her as some raving lunatic or some wayward woman who has no standing whatsoever? She would be a subject of derision. She would be mocked, and when she was banished, that would be the end of it. But yet, in this particular case, the king was angry. He didn't know what to do. He calls upon his underlings to come up with a suggestion, and their suggestion, and I think it reflects their foolishness. They suggest a decree that goes out to every single community within the Persian Empire, declaring that men are the bosses. But we know from the story that that's not really the case. You think about the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where Michael Constantine, as the father, always declares himself as the leader of the household. Everything must go through him, and in the end, he's often ignored or bypassed. In this particular case, we see these men acting foolishly, but the fact that they respond to Vashti and to Vashti's refusal, to me, is indication that she was a woman of influence. So let's take a look at a couple of the texts. The first one, I'm just going to read to you about this Vashti's end. Achashverosh, the king, is enraged when he hears Vashti's response. The text says, the king was greatly incensed and his fury burned within him. In the rabbinic account, this is what the sages had to offer as homilies, God fanned the flames of Achashverosh's anger. He told the angel of fury, go and kindle a flame within him. Breathe it into his body and throw sulfur into his oven. His rage did not subside during all the years after Vashti's banishment until Esther's appearance. According to one opinion, his anger was assuaged only when Haman was hanged, and then offers a proof text to say that his anger, his fury abated after Haman was hanged, and that consequently the hanging of Haman abated God's fury. So, just briefly, what do we have here? At least according to this story, this text, the king does find Vashti responsible for her actions. And that's an important statement because we'll see later on, he does not hold her responsible, but rather sees the culpability elsewhere. But at the same time, as he holds her responsible for this refusal, for defying him as the supreme ruler of the empire, his anger is somewhat diluted by the fact that it persists up until Haman is hanged. It seems to suggest to me, at least according to this particular text, that while the king was furious over Vashti's refusal, there were a number of incidents in his life at this point which increased that fury, which fanned the flames. It wasn't just Vashti which incensed him, but somehow Haman. And even though we know that he elevates Haman to a position of power, ultimately this text argues that Achashverosh expresses an anger not only directed at Vashti, but even directed at Haman, so that somehow the anger toward Vashti was even diluted, which enables us perhaps to look at the story from a different perspective, that while he was angry at Vashti, maybe he was a man who was prone to anger. He angered very easily, had a short fuse, and therefore, while he was furious with Vashti and acted maybe somewhat impulsively, his anger was not only directed at her, and that, for me, kind of dilutes the anger a little bit and perhaps demonstrates that Vashti wasn't so terrible, her offense wasn't so egregious. She just happened to be victim of a short-tempered king. So that's the first text. But here, at least, we see that the king does hold her responsible, and his anger is directed at her for her own actions. The second text focuses on Memuchan, one of the 7 eunuchs, they're called, one of the 7 underlings of the king, who counseled the king to depose Vashti. And here's the text. It's a very interesting description of Vashti and how Vashti was portrayed, at least by Memuchan, one of the servants. The rabbis observe, and again, remember that this is all in the eyes of the sages which followed the biblical story of Esther. The rabbis observe that Memuchan was precipitate in offering advice without being asked, from which they learn that a commoner, or also translated as a fool, leaps first, suggesting that Memuchan was somewhat of a fool. Memuchan had his own private interests when he advised the king to remove Vashti. There are 3 different views as to why Memuchan wished to be revenged upon Vashti, why he wanted to exact revenge. According to one, Vashti would strike him back and forth on the face with her shoe. In consequence, Memuchan says, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, that is, she acted unjustly toward him as well, and because of this, he wanted a severe punishment to be inflicted upon her. So according to this understanding, Memuchan wished to convict and expel Vashti, not because of any egregious offense against the king, but rather an egregious offense against him, against Memuchan. He doesn't see anything, he dismisses what Vashti did in terms of the king, and he prefers banishment by virtue of what Vashti has done to him. It's a personal vendetta. So that casts a very different light on this story. But we also see that Vashti must be a very powerful person because she is powerful enough and strong enough to subdue Memuchan. She strikes Memuchan. I don't know whether you would call it abuse, but she becomes physical with him in terms of striking out at him. So Memuchan is the passive one here, not Vashti, and the reason why he suggests Vashti's banishment has nothing to do with the queen defying the king, but rather the queen's actions towards Memuchan himself. The Midrash then offers a second reason why Memuchan wanted to be avenged, because Vashti did not invite his wife to the women's banquet. So, and there's a proof text that's given for that, but again, here, he feels slighted. And because he was slighted, he wants to exact revenge against Vashti, having nothing to do with Vashti's refusal to appear before the king and the banquet. And the third reason that Memuchan has is that Memuchan had a daughter, and he wanted Vashti to be deposed so that his daughter could marry Achashverosh. So that Memuchan was motivated by self-interest in wanting Vashti deposed, because then he could suggest that his own daughter would take Vashti's place. So what we see here is, in reality, no crime. There is certainly no offense recognized against the king, but rather Memuchan just has a personal vendetta here. But the fact that he even offers this suggestion to the king is a sign that Vashti is not to be taken lightly, that Vashti is recognized as an imposing force. Vashti uses some kind of physical violence, if not violence, and some kind of abuse, or Memuchan perceives it as abuse. She is too powerful to be ignored, and so Memuchan wants to take action. Again, nothing to do with an offense against the king. So now we're going to come to, in the third text, the question about Vashti's fate. The book of Esther, as I mentioned, doesn't explicitly tell us what happens to Vashti. What is her fate? So here's what the text has to offer. Sometime afterward, this is after Vashti is deposed, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her, but without specifying what had been befallen her. So in other words, there really is nothing in the text, in the book of Esther, that tells us what happened to Vashti. 4 verses earlier, Memuchan suggests, if it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall not enter the presence of the king. So here, even though some time has passed since the incident took place with Vashti, the king is still angry. The memories are still vivid, which once more calls attention to Vashti's authority, her power, and the fact that she wasn't just summarily dismissed, that she was recognized as some kind of a force. Her action was considered so severe that it is not taken lightly and not forgotten. But nevertheless, there's no crime that's indicated. But then the text goes on to say how Memuchan possibly proposed that the king depose her as queen, banish her from the palace. A recurring theme is that Vashti was not merely deposed, but executed. So that there are rabbinic texts which describe Vashti's banishment as not just a physical banishment from the kingdom, but death, the death penalty. In all of this, and in this interpretation, Memuchan suggesting that Vashti not only be deposed, but perhaps even be executed, does this reflect an expression of male dominance, that the men can simply do what they want? Or do they act out of fear of Vashti? In other words, not only by deposing her, but by killing her. Why do they kill her? Do they do so because that is the manner of powerful rulers? Somebody defies them, they put them to death, and there's certainly a lot of merit to that conclusion. Or was there something more? Is it possible that Vashti was still such a feared presence? Even though she is deposed, she has to be executed. She can't live. Not simply because she defied the king, but because there is a fear about her and about her personality and her presence. Remember, after she refuses to appear before the king, all of the servants gather around and try to come up with a solution as to what should be done concerning Vashti, and they issue this decree that all women should be subservient to their husbands. Why would this be necessary if Vashti were just a powerless woman? So keep that in mind. The text then goes on to say that in killing Vashti, going with this idea that she was executed, God fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah, and I will wipe out from Babylon name and remnant, kith and kin. Memuchan's suggestion, as presented in the Midrash, was to place Vashti's head on a plate to behead her, and Ahasuerus accepted his proposal. So according to this idea, this execution was in fulfillment of a prophecy that Babylon should be wiped out, and Babylon was synonymous with Persia. But again, who is being wiped out? It's Vashti. So that somehow, even in this negative way of describing Vashti's presence, Vashti was so feared that she was executed, and by executing her, this was a fulfillment of a prophecy to wipe out from Babylon name and remnant. In other words, to wipe out those enemies who need to be destroyed. And Vashti was so powerful that she was the one who had to be killed, and her killing then was a fulfillment of that prophecy. And here we see that Memuchan's suggestion to the king was accepted, but once more, why kill Vashti if Vashti were not some kind of a presence. But now there's another midrash which explains how it takes it in a different direction, that the negative effect of wine is like a snake bite, separating life and death. Thus, Vashti's excessive drinking led to the Achashverosh's, excessive drinking led to the death of Vashti. A whole new direction here. In this particular case, it is the king's sin and not Vashti's which leads to her banishment/execution. This text suggests that the reason for Vashti's banishment or execution is that the king was drunk. There is no culpability on Vashti's part. She did nothing wrong. The king simply was inebriated and he acted without having full wits about him. And therefore, Vashti is, in a sense, exonerated from any kind of wrongdoing. But this idea of the king being responsible is going to be duplicated and even magnified in the text that I'm about to share with you. So we have here a little bit of a transformation in thinking, a transition in thinking from Vashti being culpable to Vashti being the subject of vendetta to Vashti just being the tragic consequence of the king's inebriation. But now follow this last midrash. The midrash tells us that Achashverosh acted improperly when he issued the decree that every man should wield authority in his home. And this I find a remarkable text considering its time. And again, remember, we are not talking about a contemporary standard. We are talking about an ancient era, which was generally dominated by men. And yet within that environment, this text comes forward. This text was issued and was written. This is not the way of the world. This is a response, a counter to Achashverosh's decree that every man should wield authority. The midrash now, the text, is going to contradict that by saying, if a man wants to eat lentils and his wife desires peas, he cannot force his will upon her. Rather, she acts as she wishes. Similarly, Achashverosh acted inappropriately when he attempted to compel Vashti to obey him. Ladies and gentlemen, this might not be anything more than an expectation today. But again, considering antiquity, considering the fact that it was a male-dominated world, here we have an admission or a statement on the part of the sages that what the king did was wrong because it represents inequality, it represents sexism. Here, women are respected and need to be respected by men, and this text condemns the king and condemns men in general for any act of sexism or inequality, which would seem to go against conventional thinking of that time. My teacher, Professor Judy Houtman, had written a book years ago called Rereading the Rabbis, where she tries to describe even how within a male-dominated rabbinic civilization there were still many examples or several examples whereby women were treated like equals, and where the male sages recognized that women could not be treated as chattel, they couldn't be treated as victims, they had to be treated as equals. This text here suggests the same thing. So it's not only about Vashti, but it's really about the treatment of women in general. And so even drawn from rabbinic tradition, we have this idea that Vashti's stance against the king was not just seen as an act of a defiant individual, but rather was she was symbolic of an entire gender. She becomes a symbol for all women standing up and expressing their right to equality. And even though Vashti suffered her fate, whatever it might have been, nevertheless, she's become an important symbol for equality, a symbol for feminism, and something that is legitimated by the text itself. I have one more, which again draws on the same thinking. In the Midrashic depiction, the homiletic depiction, when Achashverosh drew sober, and again, I think this is a remarkable text, and it does not reflect the language in the book of Esther, but rather is a reimagining of Vashti. He regretted what he had done. He recalled Vashti and her proper behavior, and he also remembered how he had improperly condemned her. And then it offered another tradition, has Achashverosh wanting his wife when the effects of his intoxication wore off. He was told, "You killed her." He asked, "Why?" They, meaning all of his officials. And again, I think this is a remarkable text. They replied, "You said for her to come before you naked, and she did not come." He admitted to them, "I did not act nicely." "And who counseled me to kill her?" They told him, "The 7 ministers of Persia and Media." He immediately, this is the king, killed them. Consequently, the 7 eunuchs are not mentioned again in the book of Esther. So what do we have here? Not only does the king become culpable for his actions, not only does the text condemn the king for his actions, but the king himself admits he acted inappropriately. He admits that what he did was wrong, and he comes to regret his action. And then he takes one step further and he asks what happened, because, when you're in this, when you're drunk, you don't necessarily have control over your faculties, and he apparently was so drunk he was unaware of his actions. So he asks his servants what happened to her. They say, "Well, you deposed her because of her refusal." And then when the king admits, "I was wrong." He says, "I was responsible for what happened. I am wrong." It's remarkable that a text actually puts these words in the mouth of this king. But then when he learns that his servants ordered or suggested that she be killed, he has them killed. And his feeling here is that he was drunk. And when he reached out to his servants, they in essence placed a stumbling block before the blind. They took advantage of his drunkenness. They suggested that Vashti be deposed or killed. And when the king becomes sober and learns what happens, he's furious at his servants for suggesting that he kill his queen, and for suggesting it while and not realizing that he was not thinking logically in his inebriated state, and therefore as a punishment he kills them. So what do we have in all of this to summarize? Vashti, now understood in a more comprehensive light, is powerful, she's influential, she's feared, but she is also seen as noble and good. The punishment that was carried out against her is condemned by rabbinic authorities. What they did, what the king did, is seen as an unjust act. And in essence, the later sages exonerate Vashti for anything she might have done and basically reverse this, their thinking about this egregious offense in refusing the king, and they argue otherwise. So we see one parallel here, and then we'll sum up, between Vashti and Miriam. Miriam is held in there's a certain definition, a perception of Miriam in the Bible, but the later sages reinvent her, reimagine her as someone who is much more influential and much more noble, much more central than even the Torah gives her credit for doing. And the same thing for Vashti. Vashti is merely seen as a queen who is defiant, who refuses the king, and therefore is banished. But our rabbis or sages were not satisfied with that portrayal, and therefore they reimagine her in a way which elevates Vashti to this noble woman, a woman who is fighting sexism of the time, a woman who is courageous enough to do so, a woman who is treated unjustly, so much so that even the king who decreed that she be banished, even the king demonstrates remorse and regrets what he did. And therefore, Vashti is elevated to a place of honor, and that is part of why we have restored that honor today, and why for so many, Vashti is this symbol of courageous equality, one which all people deserve. Again, Chag Sameach.